Hello, and welcome back to Online Education Across the Atlantic. We've had a lot of interesting things happening this year so far, and we've already talked about we're looking forward to the summer and our conference travel. And so just a lot of things happening this year, not a boring year. But today, one of the things that we wanted to cover in more depth was this topic around marketing, particularly around online programs and even hybrid programs, because so much of the OPM market is driven by this situation. Marketing and student recruitment is the center of the OPM market. But we seldom talk about, well, why is that such a core need for nonprofit, colleges and universities to often get help doing that? And it's not always an OPM partner. There are other vendors who help that. So we wanted to talk about the challenge of marketing in a digital world. That might be one way to look at that. But before we get to that, just wanted to check in on some news items. And, in the U.S., we keep coming up with the same nature of news items. So I'm going to take one that's a little bit different. So it's not all about DC federal moves. Morgan shared this morning on our Slack about Sacramento State University and the Cal State system, 23 campuses. They're facing a potential budget cut from the state of $375 million. And then that gets apportioned out. I think it's roughly 8% of state support they're looking at getting cut. And this is at the same time that the cost of running universities gone up with inflation and pensions and various aspects. And you have the long-term enrollment declines, particularly with regional public universities. And so there's a lot of, to be honest, a lot of come to Jesus moments that are happening at universities. But the thing that's interesting is, to me, is in the Cal State system, you had Sonoma State University. They saw how big the problem was, particularly with their enrollment, and they came out and they said, we're making some pretty big cuts, including we're getting rid of athletics. Doesn't add value. We're in a crisis. We need to focus on this. They also cut academic programs. They have an experiment they're doing with three other regional universities to do a shared services model to see if that'll save money. And there's a lot of pushback on that, as you can imagine. Chico State University, I wrote about that as well, where they've verbally acknowledged the problem. But if you look at their strategic plan, it's pretty much playing with org charts, and I'm highly skeptical it's going to work. Where Sacramento State comes in is they had the same issue. How do we cut things? And they looked at how do we go, reduce the number of academic units is one of their core plans. They also have reduced hiring, et cetera. But saying if we have fewer deans, one way to look at it, fewer deans and deans' offices, it'll be more efficient. The news item is they're backtracking off of that plan already because of pushback. So the reason I mention this, we know about colleges and universities needing to cut budgets, but at least there you're starting in Northern California, you're starting to get a quorum of there's so much pushback, even the efforts they're doing are getting torpedoed. And I'm not arguing that they had the world's best plans, but it's a little bit concerning to me that we're not even finding out how they're going to deal with these issues.
As you were talking, I was thinking it's less a come to Jesus plan than a Saint Augustine plan, like give me chastity and continence, but not yet.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, we don't like that idea.
Yeah.
I think what you were describing in terms of the pushback it sort of resonates with one of the stories very close to home for me around Cardiff University, because they were kind of announced a lot of closing of departments and redundancies, that's all been kind of put on hold, and there's been a bit of a reprieve because there was such a movement around that. And I don't know how much that chimes with the kind of story that you're relating to, but I think that's going to be it feels like universities in general are in similar positions, and then there's all of that kind of pushback. And what do you get in the end? Do you get anywhere ultimately in terms of tackling problems?
The pushback I'm seeing in these cases are pretty much blanket pushbacks. I mean, the faculty association did make an argument of, they actually made the argument saying you don't actually need to cut any academic programs to continue things. And I think there was a misreading of the finances, but they're arguing against change. Well, it's just plain as day. They've got to do something. So I would hope that we would have more pushback that would say, hey, going from 7 to 4 academic departments only saves you this much money, but here's the impact on students. This is a better approach, and here's some details behind it. An alternative. So the concern is we're getting a lot of pushback, but some of that pushback doesn't even acknowledge math and what they have to go through.
Yeah, I think that's the key point, isn't it? Because I think ultimately, if the pushback is just about which I think it feels a bit more in the Cardiff case, perhaps, is a pushback is all about figuring out all the different ways that you can put so much pressure on the university that they stop what they're doing, and not necessarily having an alternative plan. It's often mentioned over here, oh, the university has X amount of reserves, and you chat to finance directors and they say, look, that's not something that we, it's not like something we get out the ATM and, we're sorted, for the month. So, yeah, I think we'll see that. I think actually that's going to be an interesting trend for me this year. The extent to which a positive change happens on the back of, pretty difficult situations. We'll have strikes coming, I'm sure, as well. So that's going to add pressure.
Yeah, you described it pretty interesting. How many different pressure points, paraphrasing you, how many different pressure points in order to get these changes to stop? Seems to be the nature of it.
I mean, just going on to the Cardiff one was interesting because they even they took something that the Vice Chancellor had put in a paper several years ago that I can't remember the exact example, but it didn't reflect her in a very good light. And so you can talk about that as a specific example, or you can kind of jump up from that and say, look, this is another tactic, you could say, like actually a personal assault on the VC, and it's another element of kind of that building pressure on the university.
I know of a campus here in the US where that is happening too. It's a personal based attack because of this fear of change and this desire to not make change, even in the face of a very explicit need to do so. So yeah, it's a crazy, and I think we'll see more of it. And I wonder how many provosts and presidents in the US will also lose their jobs because of this need for change and the inability to take faculty with them.
Part of the problem there is, well, it depends on your point of view. If you're against market consolidation, fewer and fewer choices, and if you would like to support public education, that it's a state good and you need to do it, then it's a bad thing. But this sort of gets to a structural argument of, can public institutions reform themselves in a way to effectively serve students with new economic realities? And this type of pushback, and this type of, we're already giving up on some before we've even tried it, doesn't bode well right now. And I think part of the effect is, in the U.S. regional public universities, if this becomes a common trend, even outside of California and the Cal State system, boy, it makes it even more dire for these schools moving forward, in my opinion. So you're right. I think it's definitely going to be a story moving forward. I think the bigger news here, wait, you called them ATMs? I thought they were called cash points over in the UK.
Look, I'm just trying to fit in.
Oh. Well, if you're going to fit in, then come to San Diego next April.
It's been a while now. I'm slowly learning the lingo.
Well, with that in mind, and that really is going to be something for us to watch and comment on over time. With that, let's get to our main topic, which is marketing, which quite often comes down to digital versus traditional marketing. Why is this such a big issue, and why can it be so difficult for traditional schools to deal with? But let me hand it over to Neil.
Yeah, it was interesting. Just a line that you said just a minute ago around universities being able to reform themselves to serve students' needs, or I think there's words to that effect.
Yes.
And I think it's interesting because I think this topic we decided to cover on the back of, I think it was a news item, maybe Morgan, that you were telling us about around a university in the US maybe ending an OPM partnership and bringing their marketing
It was the
in-house.
the Drake University and the
William
forgot
Patterson University.
the
Yeah.
William Patterson. Both of them were looking at marketing. Yes.
Yeah, and I just wondered. I thought it might be interesting to start because we all kind of recoiled or winced a little bit at the idea, and I just thought it'd be interesting to get a sense from each of you why why did you cast doubt on that, and why did you react in the way that you did? Because I think that gets the heart of the matter, really.
Well, let's recap just real quick. I know this is terrible thought in case there are any people who didn't listen to the previous episode, but the issue was Drake University in particular. They've been working with an OPM for a decade, and they're not going to renew the contract. So basically, they're declaring we're ending our OPM relationship. And they made some public statements about we're giving up too much money and we're doing this in house. We can handle it.
Yeah, like it came from a news item, so I had a slice of information that could be incomplete. So my apologies to anybody at Drake, um, if I'm misrepresenting it. But I was sort of concerned that the decision was being driven by budget concerns and that it seemed to be very faculty heavy. So they talked about the head of the department being linked on all communication with students and there to answer questions and things like that. And they were sort of fusing enrollment and recruitment. And it could potentially be a lot of work and a pattern of work that most faculty members are not used to doing. So that was sort of what gave me pause there. As opposed to the William Patterson, they sort of seem to have a different sort of kind of conversation there about what are the risks, what are the potential payoffs, and let's balance those. I've heard over and over again from many places, part of the challenge is that nobody on campus understands marketing for online students. And so
Yeah.
they have to go outside.
Well, that gets to why I recoiled, is it just felt very much offhand in nature. Oh, we should be doing it and benefiting from the additional money from it. And yes, it was an article, but it was an article that was pushed by the university. And there was nobody saying, hey, we've completely changed how we do marketing and student recruitment, and we've proven that we know how to reach online students, and we have the infrastructure in place to do things this way. There was nothing of that nature. It was almost, hey, this has to be easy. We'll do it and take the money ourselves. And we've seen it so many different schools that when you do traditional marketing for a school that has any sort of name, quite often it's almost a benefit to make things difficult. Students want to come to your school. So we give you a nice glossy brochure. You might get it within a week or two. We'll invite you to campus because we know you'll love our campus when you come visit. And it's got this back and forth. You want to be here and you're privileged to get this info from us. With online and access-based education, and the two overlap a lot, it's much more based on we need to fit into your life. And we know that you're searching for information on this program Saturday at 11 p.m. And if you don't get information in a matter of minutes or hours, you might move on and go look at another program. So it's all about the prospective student, and it's all about timelines and very digital in nature. And they're just fundamentally different mindsets around marketing. And I think you need to prove that you know the difference and that you can handle both. The example that I used was Arizona State University. Yes, they worked with Pearson and they got rid of Pearson. It took, 5 to 10 years for ASU to build up their own capability set to be able to say, all right, we can now handle this 100% on our own. Took them time and a lot of investment. I don't see indications of any of that at Drake. I don't apologize the way Morgan is ahead of time because they planted that article. If they wanted to give people confidence they knew what to do, they should have said so. So I'm a little bit less forgiving.
Yeah, that's follows a trend maybe on the podcast. I don't know. Maybe that's being unkind on you, Phil. But yeah, I think I echo a lot of those thoughts. I mean, I think if it's kind of presented as a financial thing as well, my mind immediately thinks, actually, do you realize how much it costs to market to an online audience, like you said, Phil? It's not like a traditional kind of maybe undergraduate audience that kind of you have to reach in different ways and at different times and do things quite differently. And yeah, it's so interesting hearing your guys' perspective on it, because this is such a frequent challenge that I feel like I face when I'm working with the universities, to try to convey the gulf in what they do for undergraduate students and that kind of traditional path into university versus online, especially if they're kind of moving into it the first time. And we have another additional layer over here, because we have a central admissions service that the students go through, and so you had to have this kind of other layer over here. I'm interested in what you think the kind of nexuses of the kind of crux of the differences. If you were kind of trying to get that across to someone, what are the kind of key differences between those two audiences, between the kind of marketing strategies. And I'm just wondering how we're talking about this kind of dichotomy between how universities operate and outsourcing to someone who's kind of got experience in it. But I just wondered, what's the step that universities can make themselves to go down that route? Because you said, Morgan, you felt like this was going to happen more often. If it is a binary choice of insourcing or outsourcing, or can universities kind of make the step in the right direction with it?
I don't think it ever is a binary step, because even if you look into places that are famously doing it themselves, Southern New Hampshire and Oregon State, they all work with marketing agencies to some extent. So there's always some marketing agency helping with something, with a campaign or sort of something like that. But I think what Phil said about, in a way, marketing between on campus and online is sort of upside down, like it inverts it. The institution is front and center with on campus, the person is front and center with online. How are we going to fit around you and things. So I think that is sort of the core of it.
I would add, well, two things. One I already mentioned. You're talking hours, not weeks, or minutes, not days, in terms of responding and providing answers to questions as people start interacting with the program. And that's the biggest one that I hear on a functional level, but it's got a lot of implications behind it. That means, well, how do you organize and who's going to cover the off hours, stuff like that. But one thing we're talking about, and since as long as I'm the bad guy in this episode, it's somebody who knows what they're doing. If you cannot just take a traditional marketing and student recruitment lead and have them add to their portfolio online and digital and online programs in particular and hope that's going to work. You better have somebody who already fundamentally understands, like what Morgan said, the upside down nature, and it's a different approach, different metrics. So you better have a leader in there who already gets that for that to happen. I don't think this is something where people can just evolve in their role.
And I think that's a really interesting dynamic in organizations, because this is often what I say to universities who are kind of moving into online for the first time. Sure, you have a marketing team, you have student support, you have learning design, you have the functions, right? But they all need to function differently, and or if you're kind of assessing how well they might be set up for online, you kind of have to assess it based on the different needs of that audience. And I think that's one of the real challenging things, because I think just thinking of the kind of particular challenges, I guess there's a sense in which does the university realize the level of investment that it might need to make into marketing, just from one point of view? Do kind of the leaders who are making those decisions kind of appreciate that and appreciate the difference for online? But I think then there's the kind of element that if you're doing marketing in a university and you're kind of heading that up, it's quite difficult to then come in and say, actually, you're not quite up to scratch. And I think there is that, for online, that takes a degree of humility, I think, as a person to be able to kind of acknowledge that as well. And I'm not saying I've seen a lot of instances of that, but I think that's another added complication around moving into online that maybe doesn't get talked about as much.
It would almost be easier if we had a different name, if it wasn't called marketing in particular, if it was called online targeting. I'm just making something up, so that from the beginning we're saying we have this new void we need to fill of a function, online targeting. All right, we know we've done marketing. Well, we need to decide, can we take that group and move them into this completely new role with new expectations and set that up from the beginning, or do we need to outsource? I think part of what we get tripped up at is, no, marketing's my job. We already do marketing. And so that nomenclature gets in the way. And I'm not suggesting we can change that. I'm just saying a lot of the problem is having a functional name of marketing and then having to convince people over time that, no, this is different.
But that's kind of hits on an interesting element, is the answer that because there's that kind of classic kind of choice, I suppose, when you're doing online, where do you focus operationally on kind of bulking out all the other stuff that you do so that it can support online, or do you try to kind of have a separate operation? And
I think we've seen both, and it depends on if you. We have somebody we've talked to recently where they're pretty much taking the approach of, no, we need to rethink this sort of marketing and strategic enrollment management across the university. It's starting with an online perspective, but very quickly they're saying, no, let's look across the university. So we've definitely seen that. I've definitely seen, hey, let's set up, it's almost the Skunk Works idea. We've got to create a separate unit that we can allow it to operate differently and stay away. So I think this one probably depends on the leadership and culture of the university, that you can go either way as far as which is the better approach.
And I was just wondering as well, just to kind of expand on that a little bit, like we talked about, obviously Morgan, you gave the example that universities are using kind of agencies all the time, but I guess one of the kind of avenues for outsourcing that looms large over this is kind of the OPM partnerships. I personally feel that the marketing and recruitment is the one thing that they do. Well, maybe this is overstating the case slightly, but it's the one thing that they do that is probably hardest or least within reach for a lot of universities.
I'm beginning to wonder whether you read my post about this, because there was a nifty little chart which showed that 91% of people who are using an OPM, small n, it was a snap poll from UPSIA, but 90% of people who are using an OPM use it for marketing. So it's like the one very consistent thing that folks do. And I think one of the issues is speed. One of the things that OPMs do is just get something going really quickly. And so there isn't the slower build-up time of what the costs are. Because I have been doing some research, because I am going to write something about this at some point, and I am struck in conversations that I get to be part of, and that's how I found the William Patterson thing, was how much places do tend to actually underestimate how much it's going to cost.
And I think that's a huge aspect, because it gets all... Traditional marketing more has a functional budget and manage your budget. And, it's also hard to measure in traditional, particularly if you get to, in the U.S., school that has a football team, because that really is quite a bit of that is marketing. Trust me, University of Alabama gets a lot of marketing value from its football team. But with online marketing and recruitment, it's much more of an investment, and that's where you get the surprise at how much it costs. But that also gets into the scale. You have to have a certain scale of programs to really hit break even. And probably the biggest reason that that's true is because of the cost of marketing to be effective. So you get into this new game of we need to be at least a certain size to be self sustaining.
Yeah, I feel like speed is a really important element of this because it's different dimensions of it. There's a kind of speed to lead kind of thing in terms of responding to people and being timely with that kind of thing. But I think there's also elements of speed in terms of the changes. I mean, there's some of the things I've seen in institutions or heard about in institutions. You've got things like, a really updated CMS that doesn't allow you to make dynamic changes to a web page as a part of a kind of marketing tool. I've heard of examples of universities where website changes are just by committee. You hear of people still using printed stuff, people just not really doing anything in the digital realm, really. And so, like, there's all of the kind of organization and technology change, and often, particularly in terms of the technology, there's a long list of things that need to be fixed. What you said, Phil, earlier, you need to know what you're doing, but there's also how good is your infrastructure. There's universities over here still really aren't using a CRM. They're not kind of getting leads and they're not responding to them in that kind
And
of way.
those cost money too.
Yeah, exactly. So I think I think that's a really important calculation for a university in that, how quickly can you have some of the infrastructure in place that you need to be able to even compete yourself. And so, yeah, maybe it swings back to kind of what Morgan was saying, is it feels very naive to frame bringing marketing in-house as being a kind of a cost saving.
Well, it'd be fascinating with Drake to see if what is their CRM deployment? Do they have, and keep in mind with CRM, it's sort of like the back office system. It's not just that you have one, but it's the configuration. It's very complex. If they have a CRM, how is it configured? And is it set up in a way that can handle this type of rapid, quick response type of communication with prospective students? And yeah, you're right. You need to do that first. You can't just say, all right, we're going to do marketing. Now let's figure it out. And I'm not saying Drake has gone that far, but it would be really interesting to see how is their CRM set up? Have they already thought through these issues?
One of the other sort of things I think that's a difference between regular marketing and online marketing is it's much more program specific as well. Like you seldom see, except for little bits of things, a political science department advertising their PhD or something like that. Whereas online marketing does tend to be very program specific. And one of the things I've been exploring recently is looking at ways that central online units cope with programs going rogue a little bit. And one of the things that happens is programs go and they'll end up bidding against each other internally for the same keywords, so it actually is driving up the costs, which is sort of interesting.
Is that true in the UK as well? Because it's absolutely true in the US. Is the fundamental shift to much more of a program level marketing as opposed to institution level? And it's not a black and white, but that shift is huge. Do you find that in the UK?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think I did a talk recently and I kind of touched on marketing for online. And one of the examples that I gave to represent the kind of gulf in the marketing for different things was Instagram's a brilliant example of this because you can see the grid. You can see the grid of all the pictures. And so I just kind of went onto Bristol's grid, and Bristol's got some amazing pictures of Bristol. It's just full of pictures of Bristol. And it's just a minor example, but you can see the emphasis, all of the messaging is around the place. And I'm not saying that they can't market an online degree, but that juxtaposes the challenge just perfectly for me, because everything is about the place and suddenly nothing is about the place. It's about the program. It's about the curriculum. It's about the online experience. And I think, yeah, that is definitely true over here, and that is also a challenge because often I was chatting to a head of marketing recently at a university, who's saying we only really get into kind of the course and curriculum stuff, right at the kind of end of the funnel kind of thing. Really, that's the only time we kind of get into it. And I think, yeah, it's a sort of central challenge, really. I think there's some interesting things going on out there. Like, I've seen things like there's a small online specific provider over here that does kind of a taste a week for all of their programs, and so you can kind of enroll on across all of their programs. So there's kind of nice techniques that people are using to market stuff. But yeah, I think the fact that you are more, you're having to sell a program rather than a place is just one of the biggest issues.
So I was just looking at Grand Canyon University because they're an interesting case because it's a for-profit here in Phoenix where I live, but they have a campus, but then they built up their online that became dominant. But they're taking a lot of the profit from online and building up their campus, and then looking at that to actually help their online as well. So I was just going to their Instagram to see what does it look like. One thing I will say that's interesting, and I'll have to go look at Bristol separate. Man, this is very student-centric. There's so many pictures of graduates, and it's almost like, look how many people we graduate. And there's definitely some with campus life in the place, but they're quite interesting how student-centric they are. Maybe we could do that as a spot check of Instagram of different schools and see what we learn from that.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I'm used to people flicking onto social media when I'm talking, Phil, but I didn't think we'd happen in the podcast.
Well, ironically, my family's book club, we just read The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, and it was talking about how screen time is screwing things up. So maybe that was a bad example to do. But you did make me think about it.
No, that's good. That's good. I'm interested as well in a slightly different angle, because I think I guess the danger in this conversation is, you kind of, we're focusing on all the challenges that universities face, and I think that's absolutely the case. But I suppose what we're not doing is saying, well, are the OPMs doing this well? I'm just interested because there's a danger that we present the alternative as being amazing, and I was interested in that. Are they evolving, improving? Because for me, sometimes I think, well, there's a playbook, and how is that playbook evolving over time?
Well, I think it's all over the map. Certainly they make mistakes. They've had some issues. That there also is at times a playbook where an OPM will market something aggressively and then really back off after a while, and so trying to keep that marketing consistent is one thing, but they're all over the map. I mean, I know of some disasters with OPMs, like one program where they spent $300,000 to recruit 8 students to a master's program.
If I had to generalize, they're good at the speed issue, and oftentimes to their own detriment. So they in their bones, they know it's how quickly can you set up landing pages that give the right information, and how quickly can you say, ooh, that's not working, let's modify it. They're very good with that in general. I think they know how to reply back to students very quickly, even if it's Saturday at 11 p.m. But I would note 2 things where they're not doing it well. One is they got too used to that speed issue, and they're annoying. And then people get harassed forever. I mean, I get harassed just when I'm doing web research on either for-profit schools or OPM-supported programs, because I think they both have a very similar approach. And so they're not good on realizing, ooh, we've gone too far into harassing and pushing and just being annoying, and we need to back off. So and that can reflect very badly on the institutional brand, and there's not an awareness of it. So that's one of, I think, the fundamental weaknesses of OPM marketing in general, or their recruitment, trying to follow up with students. The other thing, I don't see very creative uses of AI yet to figure out, listen, the cost of digital marketing is going up. AdWords are going up. It's an industry, everybody knows it, not just in ed tech. and it's unsustainable. You can't just keep pumping money to Google or to Facebook or Instagram. There's got to be, to use a bad term from 15 years ago, a bending of the cost curve, a different way to try to solve this. And I think that currently OPMs are too much relying on their playbook and not enough rethinking things, particularly with Gen AI, to say, what could we do to really change how effective we are and how much money flows to advertising versus being more effective in a different way? So I don't think it's, when you say, are they doing well? Well, at least they know how to get it done and they know speed, but they have some weaknesses at large, in my opinion.
Yeah, they haven't. I don't think we've seen a lot of real innovation since the early days of 2U, in a way, I would say. So there's use of AI, but it's about things like writing copy and things like that, not a lot of really fundamental shifts.
Yeah, and I feel like that's what I see over here as well. That there's a sense of like, I think maybe to kind of take Phil's point, there's that sense of how sustainable this playbook is over time, really, and the extent to which they invest in this playbook is probably making it harder for them, and there's not that innovation and that change. I mean, it's interesting also to just think about the kind of the differences, because I worked with a university recently who'd come out of an OPM partnership and was doing marketing and recruitment in-house. It's just interesting to how they modified certain things, particularly in relation to what you were saying, Phil, around this idea that, you sign the lead capture form, you got phone calls, you got myriad emails, and I think they sort of watered that down a little bit, or they kind of modified over time their approaches. And I think that the phone calling thing, I think is an interesting difference between our two nations. I think in general, people in the UK, the kind of, what was it, Southern New Hampshire's kind of 7 seconds and they're on our feet. Was it, like, I think that genuinely doesn't land as well in the UK as it might do in the US. Maybe it doesn't even land well in the US. But I'm interested, just to take that example. Do you see the merit in a university going with an OPM for this kind of stuff, or an external marketing agency, to actually learn the playbook themselves? Because that's a question that I get asked across the whole spectrum. How effective is a partnership in building up the competence internally to then, when that comes to an end, be able to do it yourself? What's your take on that?
It certainly can be done. I mean, one argument that it's a good approach is if you don't have a program that's self-sustaining, profitable, well, you don't have something to market in the first place, so you're not going to have the opportunity to shift it in-house. So you need to build up student demand by itself. The other thing is, and I'm not sure if this is, I know that we have some differences in country-wise differences, but here the schools have to approve everything. And part of the difficulty is even getting them to approve the copy that the partner is going to use. And the fact that you're in a relationship and getting that is just an ongoing basis of, hey, we're going to try this. We're sending this out. Could you guys approve this? Give us markups before we send this out. Schools have the opportunity just to see, oh, wow, this is how often you have to do it. These are the types of questions. Oh, I see how much this is focused on the student and not the brand per se. So I think there's an opportunity for this to be a good path to move it into an institutional capability that's in-house. But not many OPMs are set up where they're going to make that easy or part of the critical path. It's not, they don't see it as their job as pushing the university to learn how to do it in-house. So I think there's an opportunity, but not a push from this. So it takes your own initiative.
And are you seeing any, in the US, are you seeing any non-OPM or non-kind of private universities doing online marketing well?
Well, people might be, I mean, you might get tired of hearing the same examples all the time, but certainly University of Florida Online went down that path and they've done it. Now, they've done it with a different scale of students from what the legislature originally thought they were going to get out of UF Online. But they're an example, of where they're doing that. Um, Arizona State is a classic one. They have a massive operation and they do it themselves. You could argue that they do it as well or better than OPMs at this point. So I almost apologize for using the same examples, but you do see schools that have taken it over and are doing a really good job.
For the past several, perhaps the past year or so, actually, whenever I travel, I try to take pictures of ads for online learning everywhere, including London, standing on the side of the road with a bus going by for an online program. And I need to actually collect those together sometime and map who's working with an OPM and who isn't, in terms of some of those sort of creative kind of things. And I've got a friend helping me as well, and she recently sent me one from an MBA program in Hong Kong airport. So I think certainly places are doing it. I know from some of the Simpson-Scarborough surveys that it can be hard to get some of that talent in-house because it's in demand, and it commands a high price. So that is a challenge, is getting that talent in-house
I
as
know a
well.
couple of schools that have worked with, there's one consultant in particular that we've worked with in the past, and she specializes in helping schools build up their own online recruitment, marketing and recruitment in-house. Um, and some schools have definitely succeeded in that. I think AT Stills University is one example of that. But I'll also point out she she's not an OPM, but I mean she was brought in to help them come up with that capability. But those are smaller examples, and it's definitely worked. When a school's already committed to bringing it in house, and they're willing to invest some in outside resources or in hiring new people or both, yes, you can definitely make that work. But there's got to be a conscious choice.
Yeah, and it probably circles back to that original discussion of the willingness to change and the ability to understand what that change needs to look like, I think, ultimately. But it's so important for online programs. I mean, not that it's not important for on campus, but it feels like such a big and important area if you're going into online ultimately.
Not wanting to, I was just thinking about this the other day because I think Dewal Shaw, who writes about Coursera a lot, he posted about one of the big brands partnering with the Mumbai Indians, the cricket team. And, Phil was saying, yeah, like that doesn't necessarily lead to a flow of students. And just that day, I happened to be listening to Jamie Hunt's podcast on marketing, which is one of the ones I consistently listen to. It's pretty good. And she was talking with somebody from Florida International University, and they have a partnership with Real Madrid. And, it wasn't giving forth students really, and they had to really consciously shift towards like bringing in alumni to talk about it and things like that. The partnership itself only goes so far. They got a lot of inbound inquiries, but no conversions until they actually really worked at it.
Yeah, it's a slightly different thing, but I do remember people saying to me in terms of international marketing, look, if your university's near a football team in the Premier League, then that helps helps something.
Yeah. One thing I know we're getting near the end, but I would argue this is really important for schools to figure out their strategy, not just in terms of online programs, but what we're really talking about so much here is student-centric marketing and access, and quite often to non-traditional students. So if you want to figure out how to do more of a lifelong learning approach and get multiple touch points with your alumni over time, guess what? You have a natural advantage because you know your alumni, but I think this is a problem that schools need to figure out even beyond online programs.
Yeah, and I think for me that's the one of the things that you said is such a key aspect is that kind of non-traditional, ultimately a different audience, and kind of reaching them in a different way.
Well, it's not an easy problem to solve, but this is there is an awareness that this is an important thing that schools are traditionally not good at. And it's not as simple as OPM or end source. It's basically how do you address this new type of marketing, and when does it make sense to use partnerships? So this is good. I think we might at some point, Morgan. I know you've been doing a lot of work on the cost. It might be good to do a follow episode to actually talk institutional level cost on advertising and
Yeah,
marketing. That might be a good companion piece as well.
I'm hoping to spend some of my extensive airplane time over the next couple of weeks, pulling some of that together. So
Okay.
I'm looking forward to you exhibiting, online learning marketing kind of posters from, around the globe as well. That would be interesting.
We should follow up on this topic. I think it's important, and I think we should on the cost and how effective the advertising is. But it's great seeing you all, and I know that Morgan will be off to Northern Europe, visiting about 5 locations before she gets to Norway. So I will talk to both of you guys after that trip on our next episode.